Hello dear Motorsport-Magazin.com friends and Formula One fans. That was the 2024 Japan Grand Prix, and away from the very front of the field we saw a really exciting and interesting race where we have a lot to talk about, but we'll also talk about the top promised. Daniel Ricciardo and Alexander Albon provided the scene of the race relatively unintentionally. The two collided with each other on the starting lap, causing a lengthy red phase. First of all, who was at fault for the accident? Let's reconstruct the situation. It all started in turn 1 and 2. Daniel Ricciardo started on the medium tyres, Alexander Albon on the soft tyres, and you could already see from the onboards behind Ricciardo that the Australian was struggling with the balance of his racing bull. He had a relatively poor exit from turn 2, whereas Alexander Albon accelerated much better out of turn 2 in his Williams, and just before turn 3 they were almost side by side, a bit too close together. Ricciardo didn't see Alexander Albon, moved over, swerved a bit, still had Lance Stroll on the inside, and then there was a collision. Both of them flew off relatively hard. Yes, the two drivers were pretty relaxed afterwards because they saw that it was a racing accident. Alexander Albon saw it coming, he hit the brakes, but it was too late. He couldn't prevent the accident. He was already thinking, yes, Ricciardo, he didn't see me. He's pulling over a bit too decisively, and that's exactly what Daniel Ricciardo said. He didn't see Albon coming from behind on the outside, underestimated the traction of the soft tyre a bit, concentrated on the inside on covering Lance Stroll. Albon, on the other hand, sensed his chance, said he had the extra grip, wanted to prepare for the next corners. Well, then it didn't work out. And the stewards saw it similarly, by the way. They also ruled it a racing accident, but clearly said that if Lance Stroll hadn't been on the inside, then the whole thing would have looked a bit different. Then that wouldn't have been an excuse for Ricciardo, and even if the whole thing hadn't happened on the starting lap, then the whole thing would have looked a bit different. Conversely, yes, Ricciardo was clearly more at fault than Alexander Albon, but there were mitigating circumstances, so no penalty for the Australian. In any case, both were out of the race. The race was over for them. The race was interrupted for longer because we still have gravel beds and real tyre stacks in Suzuka, which means that everything had to be repaired. The Williams also had to be repaired, and that is, of course, the interesting follow-up question that arises. How are things looking for Williams in China? You all know the issue. Williams has spare parts problems and has no spare chassis at all. James made it clear again this weekend that the spare chassis will only be available in Miami. In Australia 2 weeks ago, only Alexander Albon was able to start. Logan Sargeant had to give up his Bulletin because they didn't have a replacement chassis. Now at the beginning of the weekend, Logan Sargeant had a relatively heavy crash in the repaired Albon chassis, and now another relatively heavy accident. Yes, what does it look like? We can't give a definitive answer yet. There was relatively little in the press release from Williams after the race. There were only 2 quotes from the drivers. There were no statements from the team management. There was no statement. James Vowles, the team boss, was interviewed by F1 TV, but he couldn't give too much away. He said, yes, the damage, it's quite serious, but they didn't have the car back yet at that point. They were able to get a picture of it. The car was stranded on the inside in turn 5 during the race. They took photos again, we already know that, and sent it to the factory. Of course, it's a shame that quite a lot of parts were damaged on the front right-hand side again, so they are definitely running out of spare parts. They could easily reproduce the spare parts, but the problem is, of course, what happens if something is really broken on the chassis. At the moment, however, it is believed that everything can be repaired before China. But of course, the spare parts are a problem because Logan Sargeant, who had to fall back on the older specification after his accident on Friday, Williams had updates in their luggage, but not enough spare parts, and it could look similar in China, so the prospects are not particularly good. And it almost got even worse because Logan Sargeant had a small runoff, but fortunately didn't crash at the exit of the Degner and was even able to drive back onto the track himself. A relatively strange scene at that point, but everything went well again. I asked myself one question: what would happen if Williams really couldn't get it right? Would it theoretically be possible to race last year's car in China? Yes, the regulations have changed a bit. The forces acting on the roll bar during the crash test have increased, but 1 or 2 other teams would have managed that last year as well. What would happen if Williams passed this crash test with last year's chassis? Would it even be possible to race the car from the last season? I think so. Please let us know what you think in the comments. We also had the discussion in the editorial office. Would that even make a difference? But of course, there are contracts that you have to adhere to, including with the sponsors. And if something happens up front, you can still pick up points. In China, it will be another nail-biter no matter how it turns out, because we have a sprint weekend. We are on a racetrack where we haven't raced for a long time, so it will all be relatively unpleasant for Williams. The Japan Grand Prix was also unpleasant for Mercedes, even if the mines didn't necessarily look like that afterwards. Positions 7 and 9, therefore the same positions as in qualifying, but the drivers swapped positions. George Russell this time with the better end on his side. Lewis Hamilton even gave up his position voluntarily in the first stint. He saw for himself that he wasn't doing very well on the hard tyres, and then asked the team whether he should let Russell past. They then made the position swap. What was going on with Hamilton? You could see a little damage to the front wing. I would actually say it's not worth mentioning. It can't have been that. Hamilton himself also said that he had problems on the hard tyre. It's just a shame that Mercedes drove almost the entire race on the hard tyre, and they had actually planned to run the entire race on the hard tyre, because after the red flag, after the start accident, they had a free choice of tyres at the restart. They had the medium tyres on at the start. And so you could drive through with 2 sets of hard tyres, because you have to use 2 different tyre compounds. The 1 lap, of course, counts before the accident, so you could drive through with 2 sets of hard tyres. Mercedes was one of the teams that still had 2 sets of hard tyres left, and that was exactly the plan. In the first stint, they lost something at the restart due to the lack of grip of the hard tyre, and the big problem was that the performance completely collapsed after. On laps 22 and 23, Mercedes had an understanding with the drivers and called them in for a stop, but of course up until that point they have already lost too much time. The lap times had completely plummeted, and at some point in the second stint they realized that they couldn't keep this up. The tyre degradation was far too high, which is why they switched to a 2-stop strategy. Some might say it was a 3-stop strategy because we had the tyre change in the red phase, but in fact it was a 2-stop strategy. In the end, it was definitely not the optimal strategy, and that was also a bit of what made Mercedes optimistic, that despite the not-so-good strategy, they were still fighting with the others in this tight midfield, somewhere far behind Red Bull Racing. They even made up a place, George Russell at least, against Oscar Piastri. There was a nice duel between the two. There was even a very slight collision in the last chicane. Russell tried it, came from relatively far behind, of course, with the tyre advantage and better grip than Piastri with his older tyres. Then Piastri saw that it wasn't going to end well, opened up the steering after making very light contact, drove through the chicane, kept his position, and the scene was later reviewed by the stewards for 2 reasons. On the one hand, Piastri took advantage of it because he shortened the chicane, and on the other hand, was Russell's mistake okay, or was it almost a shoot down from him? In the end, you could say it would not have mattered anyway, because Oscar Piastri also made a small mistake in the chicane at the very end of the race. As a result, George Russell was able to overtake Piastri on the last lap, so at least it was clear whether Piastri had gained the advantage or not by taking the shortcut. Nevertheless, the stewards looked at this case and, in my opinion, perhaps even looked at it in a little too much detail. They listed a total of 6 points as to why no penalty was imposed, neither on the side of George Russell nor on the side of Oscar Piastri. No, that was not the case. On the other hand, Oscar Piastri was not so clearly in front either, because George Russell's front axle was already level with Oscar Piastri's mirrors, so everything was okay there. The collision itself did not happen because Russell braked far too late, but because he hit the curb and then bounced off the curb and into Piastri's car, so everything was okay. The fact that Oscar Piastri shortened this chicane, well, that was also due to the slight collision. Therefore, he took action to avoid making the accident even worse. So everything was okay there too, and he got back onto the track safely, so everything fine. George Russell, on the other hand, he left enough space so that Oscar Piastri could actually have taken the corner if he actually wanted to. All in all, nothing happened. All in all, no penalty, which in my opinion could have been dealt with a little more quickly. Mercedes in 7th and 9th place. Yes, Toto Wolff said, we're not satisfied with the places, but at least with the direction, the performance, you understand more and more now and so on. But that was unimaginable a few years ago, a statement like that after a race like that. A lot has happened in the last 2.5 years, and that's exactly what my dear colleague Marcus Steinriss has taken a closer look at. or will be taking a closer look at in Motorsport-Magazin number 96. There is the chronology of the Mercedes failure, a very detailed story at this point, so be sure to go to abia.motorsportmagazine.com and pre-order this wonderful number 96. Now we come to a team that is leaving Japan with one laughing and one crying eye, namely Aston Martin. Fernando Alonso, he delivered. He already said yesterday after qualifying, well, out of position, I'm going to lose a few places. In the end, he actually only lost one position, finished 6th. He himself says the race weekend, that was one of my top 5 race weekends ever in my career. Twice out of position at the front in qualifying and in the race. Not a single mistake made, leaving much stronger cars behind him. Maybe a bit of spectacular tactics. You did not really notice that, but Oscar Piastri said it afterwards, who drove behind Fernando Alonso for a long time. He had the feeling that Alonso had deliberately kept him in the DRS window. Why? It was so that Piastri could defend himself better against Russell, who had the fresher tyres, and a Russell behind Piastri wouldn't be as dangerous for an Alonso, so that would be the old Alonso Fox again. Really a great race weekend from him, and on the other hand, a disastrous race weekend from Lance Stroll, and that comes after an actually quite decent weekend that he showed in Australia. The Canadian, now in this race where Fernando Alonso scored big points again, Stroll only in 12th place, then he switched to a 3-stop strategy, which was not optimal either, but he put himself in this position. We said at the beginning that Albon and Ricciardo caused the scene of the race. Lance Stroll definitely caused the radio message of the race, and it wasn't even the tone of voice that amused us the most, but the content, which reminded us very strongly of a radio message from Fernando Alonso a few years ago, when he said about the Honda engine that it was a GP2 engine, in other words, an engine for today's Formula 2, one would say. And it sounded relatively similar from Lance Stroll, even if it was not so much about the engine, but more about the speed. He said it's unbelievable how bad our speed is on the straights. It is as if we were driving in a different category. Was it because he wasn't competitive this weekend? You have to say a clear no. Lance Stroll himself says, well, he had a different rear wing and lost speed as a result. Anyone who listened carefully yesterday will have heard that there are definitely different choices for the rear wings. For example, we mentioned the Sauber yesterday, or the Haas. They had chosen very different levels of downforce. You could see that wonderfully in the race. Overtaking was sometimes easier or sometimes more difficult, but that wasn't actually the reason with Lance Stroll. The difference to Fernando Alonso was minimal. As team boss Mike Crack told us, we looked at the speed values on the speed trap. Fernando Alonso, 303.9, Stroll, 303.7, so the rear wing wasn't the decisive factor. But why did the Canadian still have the feeling that nothing was working for him? Mike Crack said it was more down to the tyre delta, that they were driving with tyres of different ages depending on the race situation, which meant that traction was significantly worse, and that's how it felt for him. So much for the back of the field. There was a lot going on, and it was a really entertaining race. There was much less going on further up front, and we're used to that in modern Formula One. The fourth 1-2 in the fourth race of the 2024 season, but only the third for Red Bull Racing. Ferrari secured one in Australia. Red Bull left nothing to be desired in Suzuka. Max Verstappen, 12.5 seconds ahead of his teammate Sergio Perez, who also put in a very decent weekend. He was 21 seconds ahead of the first non-Red Bull pursuer. Carlos Sainz has done it. He has secured the next podium. That was a demonstration of power from Red Bull Racing, even though the long runs were supposedly so bad. We also touched on that yesterday, but nobody really believed it. Yes, even though Ferrari is clearly stronger on the long runs this season, it looked like Ferrari was running on less fuel that weekend. And Red Bull has, of course, also made a few improvements. Red Bull has tweaked the setup, as Max Verstappen revealed after qualifying. That worked. There were also significantly higher temperatures, which suited the Red Bull RB20. At the start of the race, the temperature was as high as 39 degrees Celsius. That was significantly warmer than the temperatures during the rest of the weekend. At the end of the race, the temperature dropped a little, almost 10 degrees less. You could see that the others coped a little better, but of course Red Bull was clearly superior overall. Changes were also made to Max Verstappen's front wing during the pit stop. There was a very interesting conversation between him and his race engineer, Gianpiero Lambiase. He said, well, I told you from the start that you should do something different. It was about the adjustment of the front wing. Verstappen had a bit of understeer at the start of the race. The whole thing then became oversteer. That's something you're happy to accept. You tune the car so that it goes in the direction you expect it to, so that you can go a little easier on one axle at the beginning, because it will then change anyway due to tire wear. So Red Bull were in a league of their own again, although Ferrari were really strong in race trim. Charles Leclerc was able to redeem himself a little. He made a one-stop strategy work, so the Ferrari is now a real tire whisperer. Carlos Sainz in third position and Charles Leclerc in fourth. Nevertheless, after this demonstration of power, is the World Championship over? At least that's what Toto Wolff said. You would have thought that after the first race, Australia was, of course, an interim high. Of course, Verstappen's retirement, which also made it exciting in terms of points. Yes, everyone knew that Japan would be a demonstration of power from Red Bull Racing. The track simply suits the RB20. He particularly loves fast corners. But what does it look like now? Now we have China. That's another racetrack that is front limited. So the front axle is more of a problem again. And that's where you think it could go in the direction of Ferrari again. We also have a sprint weekend, for example. And it took Red Bull a while this season to always have the car where they wanted it. They only have one free practice session there again. Yes, the Parc Fermé regulations have been relaxed a little. That could suit Red Bull somewhat, but perhaps we shouldn't write off every single race just yet. And that's also what Carlos Sainz thinks. He is hoping for Ferrari updates, and he's almost announcing them. He is relatively optimistic. He says, yes, when the updates come after the first third, then maybe we can also fight against Red Bull. But he still says that the championship train has left the station by then. You can't often count on something like what happened to Red Bull in Australia. That's why nobody believes it anymore in terms of the championship. On individual race weekends, due to track characteristics, updates, and mistakes, things can definitely get exciting again. And of course, it's always exciting here on our YouTube channel. You can look forward to it. There's more on the Japanese Grand Prix with our expert Christian Danner in the AVD Motorsport-Magazin here on this YouTube channel.
Whatever the topic, if you have a question or two for me, just use the hashtag AskAVD.